Welcome to the Miami Jewish Film Festival, the world's largest festival of its kind. We want to thank all of our members, sponsors, community partners, all of you film lovers, and especially our presenting sponsors, the Center for the Advancement of Jewish Education and the Greater Miami Jewish Federation for their continued support throughout all these years. My name is Sandra Lilienthal. I'm one of the adult educators at the Center for the Advancement of Jewish Education. I'm excited to be having this virtual conversation with director Ernesto Honigsberg from the movie When Tango Meets Klezmer, which is premiering at this year's festival. Thank you all for joining us. Welcome, Ernesto. Tell me a little bit about yourself and about how you got into filmmaking. Was there any film that inspired you or any filmmaker that made you want to be like that person?
First of all, thank you, Sandra, Douglas, who is helping us here also, and the festival. For me, it's always a big surprise that people watch this film that is so personal, it's so familiar, and it makes sense to another people is always a shock for me. About your question, I love movies. I go to cinema a lot, and I don't know if I can point out one inspiration for the movie. I think it was something that happened. I don't know, it needed to happen. So I'm not a filmmaker. I don't consider myself that. I did one film, maybe I will do more in my life, but I had a story to tell, and there were a lot of possible supports to tell this story. So at first we thought on making a book, writing about their biography with the sheet music that we found in the boxes. But then we realized that the movie would be perfect. First of all, because there was a quarantine, so it was easy to everyone see in their homes. Second, that we needed to use image and audio. Like the songs were really important. A book may also come in the future, but we needed people to hear the music, because when I heard those songs that first were only pieces of paper, and when Alex, my friend who plays in the movie, played them for me, I saw how wonderful they were. So we needed people to hear that, and so this for me was the perfect way of telling this story. But it, as you saw, it's very amateur. In Portuguese, amateur comes from the root of love. So amateur is non-professional, but also because it's made with a lot of love. I think it's important on the movie.
I agree with you. It makes a big difference. You're not telling somebody else's story. You're telling your grandparents' story. And that obviously does make a difference. Do you have a relationship with music, being that you come from a family of musicians, or did that gene not pass down?
It's very funny. My grandfather raised my father wanting him to be a musician, and maybe it was a way of him rebelling himself, not being a musician. So he ran out of music classes. So that gene was lost in those generations. And I play a little bit guitar, but I'm not a musician. But my luck is that I have a lot of musician friends. So it's very nice to have a lot of people to exchange about this. And Alex, who was the first one that played the songs, he played and he asked me, you think this is the way that your grandfather would play this song? And I said, yeah, and that, I think that, but I'm not a musician. I didn't speak in musician language. I spoke in the language of the feeling of the song. So it was very funny, the construction of this process.
I will say that I did not know. I have been involved with music for a very long time in different ways, but I had never known what was the origin of the word klezmer. So for those of you who watched the movie, like that explanation was so beautiful. It is a music vessel, and it's just was touching. I thought it was touching. When Tango Meets Klezmer really shares with the entire world the story of your family, of your grandparents. You didn't meet them. After making the film, do you relate to their memory in a different way? I'm sure you grew up hearing stories about them, but it's different to hear stories. And now, having really become a specialist in their lives, in their work, how did that change your relationship with their memory?
It's a very hard question, but very important. I don't consider that my research on their history is done. So I'm currently, after the movie was realized the first time, I'm now making a research, master research on their history also, and discovering other things that are in their boxes. So I don't know, their memory instigates me a lot. And in some way, that this personal component is essential. It's the story of me, of my family, but also I believe deeply that it's a very important story, not for me, but for people who study memory, who study past, who study immigration to Brazil, who study klezmer music, who study people Jews that played music in Europe. So it has so many fields in this. So I believe it's a research for me, but for the world also. Here I'm at the Jewish neighborhood in São Paulo, from where I'm speaking now, and my grandparents lived right in the corner from where I am. So it's very familiar. I feel like I'm walking through the city and their history is surrounding me all the time, living here. So it's very special to be carrying out this research.
So you mentioned, and I think that that was one of the things that to me were very important in the movie. There are two, if not more, maybe three different topics that are brought together in a beautiful way. One is the story of klezmer and how klezmer is brought into South America. The second is the journey of the Jews from Europe to South America, and I want to add that in a minute, and also the adaptation and the consequences of moving into a culture that is not yours. All of these things are so important, and they're different, but they come together beautifully in your movie. So I wanted to ask you, the journey coming from Europe to Uruguay and Argentina, followed by moving to Brazil, was apparently very common. My own grandparents did the same kind of journey. And it always raised the question for me, what do you think they were looking for in Brazil, being that Uruguay and Argentina, which were much more developed, much more European cities, it would have been easier for them to culturally adapt to Uruguay and Argentina than to Brazil, which at that time was very underdeveloped. What do you think your grandparents were looking for in Brazil? What really got to them?
I think it's there is a bit of destiny in there. I think they came to South America. My father always told, because Rosa, my grandmother, was tired of the war and the conflict. So that's the main reason that they didn't went to Israel, because my Ernesto, my grandfather's brothers, went to Israel. So some of them survived and went to Israel. And they wanted to go to the Americas because there was this image that here is the land of the peace. There is no war around here. And probably they would have went to Argentina, but I believe, and maybe it's a research that I need to investigate further, but I believe that in the time the border were closed, the time that came here. So they couldn't go to Argentina. And I think that they knew someone that went to Montevideo. So that's why they went there in the first place. And there is a story that they had a fight with those close friends from Uruguay, and they knew another people that were here in Brazil, in Bom Retiro, the Jewish neighborhood. So they came here. So I think it's the casualities of life. I don't think it's they had at the beginning a special attraction to Brazil. They came to a place where which had open arms to receive them. So
Well, my grandfather, when he was asked, why did you go to Brazil? His answer was always, that's the place that took us in. But I was wondering in their case, because Brazil is a very musical country. Music is extremely important in Brazilian culture. And I was wondering if they felt that as musicians, they had more of an environment, a favorable environment in Brazil than they would have had in Uruguay.
I think it's very possible. In the interview of my father that is in the movie, in another part, he says that my grandfather loved Brazilian music and he plays chorinho, which is a very national movement, musical movement. And the musicians in his band were not all Jews. So there were some Brazilian specialists in Brazilian music. So they learned to play klezmer or Jewish music or party music in this band. So those exchanges with Brazilian culture were, of course, very important, but they weren't 100% integrated. So I think this is something about the immigrant life. They spoke another language, they heard another songs, even though they liked Brazilian music, but they needed to speak Yiddish. I think my grandfather came from a very German family. I think Yiddish was much more important for him here in Brazil than in Europe. There he spoke more German, I believe. So
that's
yes.
very interesting. You know, when I first heard that Te Extraño, it seemed to me much more like a tango than klezmer. And then after the song is played, Alex explains the song as a consequence of the switch from suburban to cosmopolitan life, which was very interesting to me, how music evolves just as much as other cultural aspects change. Can you speak a little bit more about how this change happened, not up to your grandparents, but to the music itself, this switch from music that is suburban, that is limited, to this music that comes out in big cities?
Yeah, I think I'm graduated in sociology. So I think that there are huge global processes that impact on that. The industrial revolution, the cities growing. So the Jews, the people that were living in these little villages, the Städtler, they were in a rural environment. They were lived in little villages, and it was another way of life, much smaller, much less integrated with this huge world. And I think my grandparent Ernesto was born in a state called Vignitz. And so his family, the Honigsberg family, probably was a family of Klezmarians, from people who lived in the shtetls and played in the shtetl weddings and celebrations. So they were specialists in Jewish music that was integrated, of course, with gypsy music and other kinds of European music. But when this process of people immigrating to the big cities, and his family goes to Bucharest in consequence, including of the First World War. So that was one of the main reasons that they went to Bucharest, the Romanian's capital. There, they started to listen one kind of music that came from South America. So Natalio, in the movie, he talks about this, how tango went to Europe. So this song that comes from Latin America and reaches Europe And suddenly a Jewish boy who came from a very traditional Jewish music family or orchestra started playing this new cosmopolitan song. So it's the globalization, yeah, and I think it's beautiful because, as you said, it's tango, but it's also klezmer. Yeah, I think it's impossible to draw the line that separates those things in this kind of song. Both influences are in there, and maybe Alex's arrangement also highlighted this influence of klezmer in his songs. But Te Extraño was a very famous song in Romania. So of these 8 compositions that I found here, it's the only one that I'm sure that he played before in Europe.
Just curious, how do you know what he played in Europe and what he did not?
I don't know of any other music, just this one, because I found here a folder with the sheet and the lyrics of the music in Romanian. So that was how the other songs, they probably, some of them had lyrics also, but I couldn't find them, or maybe no one composed the lyrics, but they demand a lyric. I think sometimes they demand words. They are songs to sing all together with the instruments. This one had lyrics. I found them in Romanian, and yes, so I could translate it, and it wasn't him that composed the lyric. He just composed the music.
Do you know of any klezmer composers in South America today? Are there any modern klezmer composers?
I live with some of them. So here in my house, I share an apartment with Gabriel, with who has a klezmer band called Klezmer Três Rios, which is the name of a street here in the Jewish neighborhood. And they are trying to make something mixing Brazilian songs with klezmer songs. So it's very interesting. They are beginning, but I like a lot the songs. And yes, I think the movement is growing up in the world, in Brazil. I think that in the 80s, 90s, a lot of people declared that klezmer was dead, that Yiddish was dead, but we are seeing a recovery of this. So now I am studying Yiddish in Brazil with a non-Jewish teacher who speaks Yiddish. So wow. My life is, there is a lot of those references. I think it's very beautiful. Getting back to your question before, how the past is all the time here in my present. I can separate the times.
That's your next movie, you know, Brazilian music and klezmer. That would be amazing. So you spoke about your father, and there are a couple of things that your father mentioned in the movie that I think are important for us to think about. One of the things he said, and I consider to really be important, is that even without having been through concentration camps, people like your grandparents are without doubt still considered Holocaust survivors, with all that comes with this. How do you think this affected you as a third generation, and even your desire to make a movie?
I think this is a very personal story that I decided not to tell in the movie, but my father was the second generation, the son of the survivors, and I think that it was very hard for him to be son of people who survived the war. So I think this rebellion that I told before, him not wanting to be a musician, was part of that. And he carried with him all along his life those boxes with the memories of my grandparents. And it was very hard for him to dig up those boxes, to investigate them. It was very personal. He carried them, he cleaned them, but it was very hard for him to organize all that and to carry on an investigation. So for me, I grew up believing this was my duty because my father also passed away 1 year after the interview that is recorded and shown in the movie. And so I'm the only Honigsberg in Brazil because my grandparents only had one son and my father only had me. So for me, it was essential to do something about that because I always believed that if I didn't do nothing, no one would do. Maybe some institution, but not this research about them. Maybe afterwards I will donate all of this material to some Jewish museum, to someone who, because as I said, I believe this is important not only for me, but before I needed to do the research that is important for me. So
we become the voices that speak for those who can no longer speak. I agree. It's important. Somebody has to do it.
and maybe I have the necessary distance from the Holocaust to be the one who can do this. My father couldn't, so it's my heritage. It's my greatest heritage, I believe.
Beautiful. It seems that your grandmother spoke frequently about the need to adapt to life circumstances, and she sort of had that motto and ended up doing the beautiful work that they did. How do you see this teaching of adapting playing out in your life?
I think I'm very lucky of never been going through anything that looks like what they've been through. So I can't even imagine what it was like. So I try to, in the movie, put this poetically with the train images and the songs, but I can't even imagine how these needs of adaptation. I keep thinking if I would be as strong as they were, if that would be possible for me to this need of the adaptation that they had. It's maybe an impossible question. I sincerely hope that I don't need to prove if I'm right or wrong. I don't want to live anything like they lived. But yeah, it's very beautiful. I think I'm very grateful that they had this strongness, and there are always a part of luck because there were a lot of strong people that died. So it's also destiny and a lot
Some
of
people
casuality.
survived physically but died inside, and they survived and shared and were creative, and that's one of the beauties of your movie, that it shows everything they were able to do and to bring to the world in spite of all the suffering
And they
went
found
through.
each other. I agree with you a lot. And it was the Holocaust that was the cause that they found each other. They will never be together. A Romanian tango musician with a Polish communist singer, Esperanto teacher, they would never meet. It would be almost impossible. So it's a very sad and very dark moment, but because of that they met, that I'm here. So it's history. It's in my blood.
I have one last quick question for you before we conclude. If you could sit down with your grandparents to watch the movie, what do you think they would say to you after watching it?
Wow, this one no one never asked for me. I really hope that they will be proud. I have this feeling that my grandmother, who was who kept all those things, she kept this for me. I have this feeling in me, and I really, the familiar point and the personal point, it's to honor their memory. So if they felt honored about that and happy by the way that their story was told, and I think they survived because of that. As you said, They, if their story is alive, so they are alive for at least some more generations. And for me, this is very important and special. So I not
As a
only
viewer, I want to thank you for sharing their lives with us. We learned so much about them and about the music that they did. It's really important to keep that story going. I'm sure they would be very, very proud of you and of how you have portrayed them and kept their story alive.
yes, and just completing myself, I talked about a lot of me, and I was afraid on carrying the movie that the movie was about me. I didn't want it to be about me. I wanted the movie to be about them. But in the process, I saw that I needed to talk about me, to talk about them, because the things were intricate. But I wanted to point out that the movie wasn't made alone. It wasn't a lone work. So for me, it was very important that everyone that helped me was in the credits of the movie, my family, my friends, the people of Brazilian Jewish Music, IMJ, Instituto da Música Judaica do Brasil, who encouraged me and helped me to write the screenplay and to produce the movie. So it's a collective effort. So just to point out that it's not a work that I've done by myself. I'm representing also more people in here.
It's beautiful. Thank you, Ernesto Honigsberg from the movie When Tango Meets Klezmer, for joining us. Once again, thank you to all our members, sponsors, community partners, volunteers, and all of you film lovers for participating in the Miami Jewish Film Festival.